Hello, everyone. I'm Saleha, and this is Chai, Chat, and Community. And joining me tonight is Tasneem Chopra, and I'm very, very excited. She is an author, public speaker, diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, and she talks on issues of leadership, cultural competence, and intersectional discrimination. Thank you, Tasneem. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you for having me, Saleha.
Um, we'll start off by you telling us something about yourself, and then we'll talk Harmony Day.
Sure. Oh,
Thank
okay.
you.
All right.
Okay.
So I was actually born in Kenya, in Nairobi, and when I was 4 years old, my parents decided to move to Australia, and it was more a decision based on a sense of persecution at the time. Idi Amin from Uganda was, forcing the expulsion of a lot of ethnically Indian peoples in Uganda, which was trickling into Kenya at the time. So my parents thought it might be probably a good decision for them to leave voluntarily before they were forced to leave. And so we came to actually Alice Springs initially for, I think it was 9 months. Would have been 4 years old at the time. It didn't last that long because my mother, she really was finding it a massive culture shock and a weather shock to go from Nairobi, which is like 25 every day, to the
Wow.
to the Red Center, or to Alice Springs, which was like red dust and heat,
Yes.
and no, at that plate where we were staying, like no, dense vegetation or forests as such. It was a big shift, and then we managed to get a transfer. My dad was a doctor through a Commonwealth entity, so he got a transfer to Bendigo, a country Victorian town, which Victoria at that time was known as the Garden State. And
Yes.
I think that kind of resonated in a way that was like, okay, this has to be better than Alice, and it was. And it was a small country town at the time. So I had a very probably conservative, insular upbringing, if anything, growing up in a country town in, I will say, the 70s and 80s, mainly the 80s, formative years for me. And having that Indian ethnicity from Africa, growing up in Australia, was a very multicultural existence. So I was navigating a lot of different identities and also of Muslim background. So you add that layer in as well, and it was layered. Some experiences were better than others. Um, but long story short, I feel like that hyphenated journey has informed my interest in how social networks operate, how people relate, how systems of governance are influenced by the experience of those from different backgrounds, how that can enrich us as a community, but how that difference can be a liability
Of
when it's seen
course.
as a threat and is seen as something to be feared instead of understood. Yeah.
Thank you. I have, I don't know, somebody's just written something, and okay, it doesn't matter. So this is Harmony Week and Harmony Day today. So, what does it mean to you, and what does cultural diversity mean to you? And do you think Australia is truly diverse?
I think Harmony Day is a concept and term that has been optimized for marketing value at the risk of being very
Yes.
cynical. My understanding of the concept of marketing Harmony Day, I call it Marketing Day. I think that's my Freudian slip coming out right there. My understanding of the background of Harmony Day is, in fact, that it is the UN Day for International Day
Yes.
for the elimination of discrimination and racism.
Yes.
So, if that is actually, in fact, the ethos and intention that informs this day of recognition, I feel these are the issues that we should be addressing. And while harmony is important to focus on, you'd actually take away from discussing the issues that require harmony to exist and flourish in the first place. So if we don't discuss and interrogate issues of racism and exclusion and social inequity, like the Black Lives Matter movement, like what's happening to the Aboriginal community in Australia and the First Nations people, then how do we actually progress to actual change? So I think that is a very big consideration for me. And I feel when we want to just focus on the positives without acknowledging the pre-existing and continuous
Yes.
decimation of natural resources, of sovereignty to land of Indigenous peoples, of the right to return of individuals in other countries who have been ousted, when we don't give that credit due to where it's at and we don't make acknowledgement of that in our policies, in our words, in our deeds, then harmony just seems like an optic, not an actual meaningful outcome at all.
Do you think we'll ever get to that stage in Australia?
I think there's a potential to, if we willing to have that, difficult conversation of and recognition of whether it's not just about reparations. It's about actually listening and hearing. It's beyond the apology though too. It's also about, I mean, sovereignty was never ceded in this country, and I should have
Yes.
prefaced my conversation with you about, acknowledging that we're having this conversation on Indigenous lands and paying respect to the elders and their contributions, their wisdom, the fact that they took carriage of this country for 60,000 years before we came, and they've totaled it environmentally. So there are learnings there which we have ignored. There's wisdom there that we choose to not listen to. So when we talk about can we get to a point of harmony? Yeah, we can if we sit back and listen, and if we allow the people of the land to make decisions about themselves, of the land, and not make them for them on their behalf. So there's still a very parochial, patronizing, patriarchal culture that dominates the way we govern and the way that we see minorities. And I think that is a sticking point. And until we can loosen that grip of that vice, which we have over minorities and anyone who strays away from the lane that we want them to be in, until we can change that, we won't have to change. We'll keep on having these conversations, Saliha, which
Yep.
is sad.
And that comes to racism. I just told you about what I went through at work, where I worked for 11 years. What does it mean, and has Australia truly accepted people of different color, background, ethnicity, and religious beliefs? I
I think it's
think people are very
impossible.
casually racist here. They'll preface it with a smile, and they just assume that because you are brown or black and not white, they can just get away saying stuff.
Yeah,
That's what I've
I
heard.
think I think well, I think it's important also to preface that we can't have a blanket statement, because whilst there is endemic racism that governs institutions and governs the way that policy is written and dictated, and certainly governs the way that leadership functions in this country, it's not the purview of every Australian. We do have good people fighting to do good things. So I think that's really important to mention. And even in the human rights movement, that is led by people of colour, but also mainstream Australians as well, who are attempting to do the good work. But I think you are right. There is an underlying current and an innocuous racism sometimes in the way that we make microaggressive comments to someone like, look, I don't hate all Muslims. I'm not scared of them.
Yes.
You're actually a really nice one. And if people could be like you, then that would be okay. Like that people
What?
can
Yeah.
say that is offensive. But what's really, for me, the bigger issue is people's belief and entitlement to say that. The fact that people think they can actually come out and say to me, you're quite smart for a migrant person, or you
Wow.
speak really well.
Yes,
Well,
I've
welcome,
been through that.
welcome to our country. I've been here since I was 4 years old. And when people say to me, and I've had this said to me, when I've been complimented on my grasp of the English language, I've actually responded with, "Thank you. Yours is pretty good." I give it back. Or if they want to tell me that, which country do you? I mean, I had a gentleman once say to me when I was working somewhere. I'd never interacted with him. He was a customer or a client of our organisation, and he leaned over a counter and he said to me, "I've been to the country where you're from, and
Wow.
it's very clean. It's very beautiful." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I was just tired of that. It was the end of the day, and I just looked at him and I said, "Bendigo, yeah, Bendigo is beautiful. You're absolutely right." And he had never heard me speak, so he didn't expect me to sound the way that
Like
I
him.
speak. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And he literally blood drained from his little white face when I said that, and he pulled himself back because he didn't have a response to that comment. And that's the thing. There's the assumptions people make based on the way that you look is something that continues to both entertain me and antagonize me. The idea that Australia looks like one particular kind of person when it doesn't, when we know that 1 in 2 of us were either born overseas or have a parent born overseas. That means the extent of diversity in this country is embedded in our DNA. It's who we are. It's 2021, not 1950. So you can't expect everyone that you see to look like it did 70, 80 years ago. It has evolved. It has changed. But
Yes.
sometimes critical mindsets at critical junctures in decision making, in leadership, on interview panels, in government, they haven't progressed.
Yes, and yes, I think we all face it every day. I mean, I know I faced it when I was working in this organization for 11 years. I was asked, as I told you, whether I how I spoke English at interviews. I was asked how I spoke English so well, and I'm a communications person.
And what did
You
you
know,
say back?
I said all of us speak English so well. I mean, this was a final interview and a communications position at a government organization, and that's what I was asked. I mean,
I
why
mean,
would
that's
I get
really,
to a final interview in communications
it's
and then be
unacceptable.
asked this question? This is anyway. The next
You,
one
you,
is
you, Salha, you make a really good point. The assumptions and entitlements of, the, I guess, the dominant class in this country can really jar you after a while when you're constantly up against having to justify your
yes.
competence.
I mean, I somehow feel sometimes that maybe the hiring managers are just ticking off a box when they yeah, we are diverse. I went I one of the this was last year before last. An HR consultant called me up and said, would you there is a position going. I am the HR advisor to this company. Would you like to come for an interview? And I was traveling overseas, and I said, I'm going to be back in a week's time, and if the job is still there, yes. And I went for the job. And it's a pretty well-known organization, and I asked them about diversity. What I meant was, the male-female ratio in the management. And they turned around. The communications manager turned around and said to me, "Oh, we celebrate Diwali." And I said, "But that's not what I meant. So a brown person is there. So all your diversity is all about Diwali. Nothing about male-female ratio. Why there are more men in the boardroom and less. That it didn't even cross her mind that that's what I was asking. She just
By
took it for
by
granted.
extension, and
Yep.
by
She
extension,
just
when you celebrate Harmony Week, that doesn't mean you fulfill your diversity and inclusion requirements of an organization either.
correct. So yes, we
Yeah.
can talk about it till the cows come home. But anyway, yep. Your role in the Collingwood Football Club. You're part of the 12-member panel. Are things
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
change the same?
Look, let's hope. We've only had one meeting so far, and I it was just a very recent meeting where I met my co-members, some who were some in person, some online, including the authors of the report, the Do Better report. One of who the principal lead was Professor Larissa Barrett, and so there was an opportunity to interrogate some of the findings, to hear their views of the experience of doing the report. But in all, I mean, all the members of the panel that contributed ideas and opinions were themselves from very diverse backgrounds, diverse competencies. And I would not have said yes to the appointment if I didn't feel it was going to make an impact. So let's watch this space, as they say.
Okay. Yes, we are all reading the papers every day. How long will it take? About 6 months for
No,
the report to come?
potentially 18 months.
So about 2 years. Okay, yes. And hopefully in 2 years' time, we will see changes happening.
Let's see. Let's see.
Um, this is something it's very close to my heart. So what can we as migrants do to educate people? People are scared to actually call out racists because of their culture, accent, because they're newcomers, or they have many hidden issues, and sometimes we're just used to it. Uh,
Yeah, look, that's a complex one in the sense. I mean, I think it also depends on how long you've been in Australia and what has been the experience of your racism, and what is your understanding and experience of systems of working through government, of working in a workforce, and understanding how community structures operate and schools operate. There's so many relationships you'll have when you arrive and that you need to work through. And when you are new, you don't necessarily, understandably, want to cause offence or push the boundaries because you're settling in and you're going through the settlement process, and you have to give that its due, because it's not an easy experience after you may have experienced dislocation or trauma of migration or whatever those reasons are. That's not to say you won't experience racism, and how you address that will probably depend on your personality and what support structures that you have in place to be able to progress that response that you make. I think on the other, I guess the flip side of that is when you've been here for a long time and you have more skin in the game, literally more skin in the game, and you've been here for as long as I have, which is a lifetime, really. There's a combination of things. You can either you can have a short fuse and just snap back, which I sometimes do. You can use humor, you can use education, you can make a career out of it, which I've also done as well. But I think for me, the one golden rule that I have when confronting racism is that it's not my responsibility to unpack the bigotry of a racist. That's not my burden. If I'm already being racially vilified, why then do I have to take on the trauma of educating them about, well, this is not the right thing to do because you actually hurt my feelings? Like, they need to do that stuff. And I think part of this expectation that people of colour have to then do the work of making white people not feel so bad about themselves because they offended us is just the wrong way to think about it. So I think we know enough in the world now about colonial rule and the impacts of colonization and imperialism that there's a power difference there, right? That caused these inequities to occur. And fast forward to 2020, people have the resources to do anti-racism education. They have the opportunity to read a Do Better report. The fact that we're even commissioning these reports to interrogate where racism exists, I mean, people know it's out there. It's not a mystery. It's not a mystery. It's I don't accept that people have like no idea that racism occurs. We all know it occurs. We may not feel comfortable addressing it. And the classic response of, well, I don't see colour.
Yeah, which is so much approach. Yes.
It's so patronising, and my response is, well, you know, that's a very comfortable position to be in from someone who is not of colour.
Yeah.
You know, of course, you wouldn't have any idea what it's like from my frame of reference to experience racism because you never have, and that doesn't mean that you see me as different, but it also means you can't possibly empathise with my experience. So, by I guess diminishing and minimising the experience of vilification that someone goes through, I think that's the starting point for me to say to them, no, you need to work on your privilege and your entitlement, because that's what leads to people saying things quite comfortably and well-meaningly, like, oh, Saliha, your English is actually pretty good. You know, don't feel bad. Like, speak up a bit more. Oh my God. Oh my God.
So condescending, yes.
Entitlement to say things like that. It's just, yeah. I think when I was younger, I took it as a compliment to some extent, and then I realised, actually, this is actually pretty insulting, because the assumption is the base level expectation of me is 0 or very low score, and the fact that I can pull together a sentence means that you're impressed. Yeah. So the issue actually here is not my competence; it's your ignorance.
You know, my ex-manager is Somali, and when he left, he set a lot of good precedents in the department, and we obviously followed him. And we had a new contractor who was hired by Abdi, and we were talking, and this woman turned around and said, "Why is it that you guys always follow what he says? After all, he's black, and English is not even his mother tongue." And
wow.
It is
well,
like,
I'm like, well, this country belongs to the First Nations. How many of those languages do you speak?
Well, you know, I mean, it's just, I mean, in their minds, it's a given that if you are a person of color, your English should be really bad and you can't speak, or you don't know, you're uneducated. However, if you've done year 10 or year 12, doesn't matter whether you're good or bad, you just sit, you are there as a manager because you're white. I mean, I've gone through that. I've had a really, really terrible, terrible person who was a manager of a department only because she's white. Not that she had any communications experience. So yes, it goes on, and we are in the 21st century and we're still talking about it and still wondering what.
Speaking of centuries, I heard a very clever retort from an Asian woman, a woman of color from the US, who was actually told this by someone who said to her, "How do you speak such good English?"
Oh my God.
And I think her response was brilliant. She said, well, 4 centuries of colonization in British education. How do you know so little history?
Wow.
Wow.
Like,
oh,
that's very good. This is another one, because I am Muslim, and so women wearing hijabs. You know, the patronizing attitude towards women wearing hijabs, the set mindset that, you know, people wearing hijabs are there. And I think the parliament once didn't want a woman wearing a burqa coming into parliament in Australia. Wasn't that the case a few years ago?
Yeah,
And
there was some. I think there was some desperately trying to stay relevant faction of the government that was trying to argue it was be a security risk.
yep,
Of course,
I
it had
know
never
we are
been
talking
raised.
about, yes.
Yeah, it had never actually been raised as an imminent security risk based on precedent, but it was an imagined risk. It was an imagined risk, and so ergo the burqa stunt that ensued, which actually made them look incredibly stupid, which was great because
Yeah.
the Muslim community literally could sit back with popcorn and watch that event unfold because she imploded in slow motion. And she even got, I believe the Attorney General at the time, George Brandis, who was not a friend of minority communities, got him to stand out in support of Muslim communities for the bigotry that she had shown in that moment. So it was a very short-lived stunt in terms of impact to the community was very little, but I think the impact to her credibility was significant. So that was a sort of, I guess, an owned goal is the term they use in soccer in that particular instance. But look, I think fear of the unknown has always plagued media, and there's always been a great foothold for great stories. If it bleeds, it leads kind of thing. And what we don't understand, we're scared of. What we're scared of is great news. So
Yes.
The hijab was something that was considered, maybe in the last 20, 30 years, as strange, this covering that was somewhere between exotic and scary. But obviously the Muslim community is diverse, and as much as women wear hijab and variations like myself, this is my interpretation of it, which causes all level of confusion, but it's me. This is who I am. There are plenty of women who don't wear it. So I come from a family where no one in my family wears hijab except myself and my daughter. And my mum doesn't, my sisters don't, my other daughter doesn't.
And
so
it's a matter of choice. Yes.
In my own family, there's so much variety of expression in my own family. So, and that's the whole point. It is a personal expression of faith and belief for those who choose to wear it, those who choose not to believe. And it's such an intensely personal thing that when it becomes media fodder, and when it becomes the subject of political campaigning, and like in France, literally political movements, it's like, how have you taken what is an intrinsically deep personal relationship of one person's connection to God and made that into a policy issue? So, to me, it's the same kind of logic, and people don't realize this. Those who are anti-covering, they think it's oppressive, and for me, it's the same kind of argument for people who want to regulate birth control and women's bodily autonomy. You're basically mandating what you think in your best interest is best for everybody else, without actually understanding that women have agency, and they should be able to make their own decisions if they want to cover, if they don't want to cover, what birth control they want to have, if they want to use birth control. This whole, I have this quote that I recently rehashed, which is, "I'm sick to death of middle-aged men regulating my womb and my wardrobe." So whether I choose to cover or not cover is no one's business but my own.
But yes, absolutely. I know this is something I have to ask you. March for Justice.
Which one?
March for Justice.
Yes.
What's happening? Yes.
Yeah, it's a long march, Sunny. How can I say? It's like, it's a year, not just a month.
Patriarchy and women feeling safe and having the right to say no, and the government's not doing anything. I mean, we all know what's happening without going into details. We all know what the Prime Minister did without going into details.
Yeah. There was some breaking news today that I understand the acting Premier in Victoria announced that there will be consent as a subject delivered in education at schools. That is a positive thing. That was literally a few hours ago that came out. And I haven't read the full article, but that was the title. So there is a move to introduce consent education in schools, which I think is great, but I would also introduce it to Parliament as well while we're at it.
That's where they need it, I think.
Yes. And perhaps corporate Australia while we're there. So I think it's essential that we do it, while minds are forming and at those formative years, and have the conversations about what consent means. And this idea that we can actually shift the conversation of women's safety and link it to men's behaviour is pivotal, rather than protecting our girls, keeping them safe. And I think people who have progressed from shaming women about what they wear and if they were drinking, or they think they might be saying, well, we just need to keep them safe and we need to protect them. But we need to be interrogating boys' behavior.
Yes.
We need to
I
be.
think that's a start. We start educating the boys, and everybody keeps talking about women should do this, and women shouldn't be drinking, women shouldn't be going out late by themselves. Nobody talks about educating a man.
Yeah,
Nobody.
yeah,
And it starts from primary school, and nobody's talking about it. It's all about, why should women feel so unsafe at all times? I mean, I have two girls, and I do get worried because I don't know what's happening, and both of them live by themselves. So it's a worrying
yeah.
factor, and I
Of
shouldn't
course
have to
it is.
worry
Of
as a
course
mother.
it is. It is, and it's a worry on so many levels. I mean, you worry about their safety because they might be on their own. They're female. They're coloured women. They might have a different faith, and suddenly your layers of fear are amplified on so many levels. And you wonder, how much does a white man have to worry about when he walks out the door?
Yes,
Like, what checklist is he going through about protecting himself for the day? It's a paradigm that's skewed heavily in the favor of men and and boys. And largely, we need to question why, instead of teaching girls to be safe, why are we not teaching boys not to rape?
yes,
Why
absolutely.
are we not teaching our sons that? And we need to start having the actual conversation about consent and rape. And I have a teenage son, and I've spoken to him about it. I said, do you know what consent means? He goes, yeah, okay, you used to get weird, Mum. I know all about
Yeah,
this stuff. It's okay. I said, no. You might know, but I'm going to assume that you've heard it from someone else. So I want you to hear it from me, and then you can decide for yourself. And this is what I want you to do, and make the right choices. And if you might be behaving in the best way, and thank you, I appreciate that. But when you are with other people, and I said that's the next level is you self-monitor, but you also you need to be part of the bystander action, not the
absolutely.
innocence. And I think that's across, whether it's family violence or sexual harassment or any injustice or racism. Even there's this whole piece on how, if we see it happening, what can we do? So again, I think while we teach consent education, we also teach our kids, if you see something going on, if you see a mate saying something
Speak up.
inappropriate, call it out. And not
Yes, and
because she might be your sister or she might be your cousin, but because she's a person. And again,
absolutely.
it's that humanizing and not gendering your compassion. It should really come from a place of being a decent human being. You wouldn't accept assault, full stop.
I
So
hope
don't.
so.
Yeah.
Yes. Um, so my last question for the evening: what can be done better by the government, organizations, and lastly ourselves? Because we need to change our thinking, like you
I'll
said.
start with ourselves first, and I think calling out the microaggressions and calling out the micro racisms, and I'm guilty of them too. We all make those collective comments about, this group is a bit too, like, oh, look how
Yes,
they're driving, and we call that out. And I've been called out by my kids so many times. I think even this evening I must have said something, or actually my daughter said something like about, oh, those girls are such drama queens, and then she stopped herself and went, that's such a misogynistic statement. You know, just because they're girls doesn't mean they're drama queens. Anyone can be
yeah,
a drama. Why queen? They're dramatic. And I'm like, yeah,
yes,
absolutely, yes, they're dramatic. So just being more mindful and conscious, because I always say little aggressions, microaggressions become macroaggressions, and micro racisms become assault. you know, you start off name calling someone because they look weird or they dress weird, and next thing you know, you're part of a group of people hurling insults, and then eventually someone's pushed down a flight of stairs, has the hijab ripped off, or has a big brick thrown through a school of faith. And these things don't just happen overnight; they grow, and they grow because we don't check them. So check your racism, check your personal racism, check your privilege. The fact that you feel comfortable enough to demonize a minority doesn't say anything about your status or what you've accomplished. It says a lot about what you take for granted. And I think we had a conversation. Sometimes it's people of color who can harbor
yes.
racism. We have this
Oh,
whole issue within
absolutely.
the Bessie community about colorism, right? About black skin privileging, their own kind over dark skin, and whether it comes to interracial relationships and whatnot. So there's a lot of there's a lot of issues that we need to unpack there. And there's a lot of self-loathing people have, and a lot of inherent racism that people have, which we excuse with funny jokes or little comments. And I have a really low threshold for that. And I find one of the worst vehicles for these microaggressions is WhatsApp groups with family and friends.
Oh my God, that's the worst.
Whoa. We've all got that weird cousin or uncle or auntie who just sends the most inappropriate thing. But because of a family dynamic, you don't know how to call it out.
Yep.
And I say you don't know how to call it out because you know that if you offend this auntie, then you're going to get a call from another auntie saying, why did you say that to auntie so-and-so? And it ends up this big family feud nightmare. So my way is if I see a really inappropriate joke, or an inappropriate comment, I change the subject instantly. And I make it irrelevant. Like, oh, check out these amazing shoes I bought today or something, if you don't want to call that out. But sometimes you need to actually address the extent of the racism, and I've very gingerly done it. I think I've addressed the issue of racism within Indian communities when there was a comment made about, I think, Harry and Meghan when they got married and how we all supported it. But then I think I had a cousin somewhere, or not a cousin, it was a friend in a very close group who made the comment, oh yes, but we do know that if our daughter or son wanted to marry someone from the African community, we wouldn't be happy about it. Let's be honest, yeah. And I just went, actually, I would have no issue with that whatsoever. I mean, for me, color is not the indicator of the color of someone's skin is never going to be the indicator of a successful union. It's going to be how you get along, what you have in common, your compatibility, all these amazing things. I mean, I could stream off 50 Indian couples that have been divorced in the last 2 years. So where's the logic in that kind of thing? And so you bring it back with facts without getting personal, right? So try to call it out if you have a good example or response to do it. Otherwise, I deflect, because the last thing you want to do is give oxygen to racism.
Organizations, do you think they're going to change? I told you what I meant.
Be that voice if you can in your organization. I mean, I do work in diversity and inclusion, so I kind of have it in my profession, in my career description to bring these issues up. So when we're organizing events or discussing policy or an issue, I'm always saying, what is the call, which is the culturally and linguistically diverse?
Yes.
What is the called angle with this particular view? How are we going to embed their view? How do we hear from them? Are you sure your message is going out to them? What efforts are we making? Are we being inclusive? And it just always brings you back, and I say this to you, if you're working in a workplace and you have clients and you're living in Australia at the time, which was, you ask yourself, okay, who is our client base? And, this certain demographic of this area of Melbourne. Right. Let's do a breakdown of what this demographic looks like. Oh, it's about 40 to 50% skewed towards a multicultural cohort of people born overseas versus, say, 50% of Anglo. Right. How does that diversity reflect in our makeup? Do we have 50% diversity in our makeup? Just because, that would be reflective of who we are. And when people as customers can't see themselves reflected in their brand, and they can't see themselves reflected in your marketing, where's the buy-in? So change the way that in order to change the way that you appeal to the public, you need to make sure that the people who make the decisions about your branding and your marketing and your imaging look like the public. So you need to hire diversely, and there's no shortage of talent. And I'm talking to you, Sally. I mean, there is no shortage of talent in this field. It's joining with talent. There is so many incredibly adept communication specialists who are not Anglo-Australian. It's a fact. There are a lot of people that do that. So I don't take the response of, well, they're just not out there. It's like, how are you marketing? Challenge the ways that your pipeline of recruitment has been operating for the last 50 years. Maybe you need to branch out a bit more, try a different university, try a new recruitment program. And so there are endless creative ways. And if you can't think of them, there are diversity and inclusion. I'm not giving myself a plug here, but there are diversity and inclusion experts who give that advice on how do you diversify a business model? How do you make yourselves relevant? How do you reflect the community that you want to be in? That's the only way to make yourself in 21st century as part of Australasia. If you're not actually playing a forwardly progressive diversity and inclusion strategy, you will be left behind.
And hopefully the government will also do the same.
Well, this message goes out to everybody, including the government.
Thank you so much, Tasneem. Thank you so much for being with me tonight.
Thank you, Sonia. It's been a pleasure for me. Thank you.
Okay. Good night and stay
Good night.
safe.